The Nakajima Ki-27 was a single-engine Japanese fighter. It was the first low-wing monoplane fighter in the Japanese Army Air Force, serving as its primary fighter between 1937 and 1940. It was also one of the most maneuverable monoplanes ever built. The Imperial Japanese Army announced a competition to replace the aging Kawasaki Ki-10 biplane in 1935. Nakajima, Mitsubishi and Kawasaki answered, each with their own design. Nakajima's Ki-27 won the competition due to its low wing loading and therefore good maneuverability. It had a light armament and structure, thus its weight was far lower than that of contemporary Western fighters. At the time, most Japanese pilots were unconcerned about armament or speed, preferring highly nimble fighters with good visibility. This would prove a mistake much later in the war. Although it may not be obvious at first glance, the Ki-27 was innovative, with an all-metal skin, flaps, an enclosed cockpit and a constant speed propeller. However, it lacked some critical features such as a retractable landing gear. It made its first flight on October 15, 1936, and production began in 1937, becoming known as the Army Type 97 fighter to the Japanese. The Allies initially nicknamed it Abdul, but then changed it to Nate. The Ki-27 entered service in March 1938 and soon contributed to achieving air superiority on the Chinese front, where it was superior to all Soviet fighters used until the appearance of late variants of the Polikarpov I-16. The Ki-27 became the backbone of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, becoming one of the most produced Japanese fighters of the war, and, in its early years, accounted for almost 90% of the Japanese Army victories, primarily on the Chinese front. However, the Ki-27's success was not limited to the Chinese front, as the Japanese fighter achieved some of its best results while facing the Soviet Union in challenging conditions during the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. This was the last of several border conflicts between the Soviet Union and Japan during 1939. It was fought along the Mongolian border, a nation which had a close relationship with the Soviet Union. Although this battle involved large numbers of troops, it was an undeclared war between the two nations. It ended with a Japanese defeat, but that can hardly be pinned on the Army's Air Force. On May 27th, the Ki-27 engaged Soviet aircraft for the first time, with 9 Ki-27s facing 12 I-16s. The results were overwhelming, with only one Japanese fighter lost and all 12 I-16s shot down. Of those 12, 4 were claimed by Hiromichi Shinohara, who would become a legendary pilot among the Japanese. We will cover him in more detail further ahead in this episode. The Japanese had quickly gained air superiority over the battlefield, with the Ki-27 proving superior to the main Soviet types, the I-15 and early models of the I-16. Soviet forces initially mistook the new Japanese fighter for a bomber and paid a high price for that error. But this would change toward the end of the battle. With the introduction of later versions of the I-16, a general shift in tactics, and the addition of several ace pilots, the Soviet Union was able to fight back in the skies. Nonetheless, the number of Japanese aerial victories ranged from the exaggerated figure of over 1,000 claimed Soviet aircrafts to the conservative figure of 208 acknowledged by the Soviet leadership. The more conservative values give a total of 97 Japanese fighters shot down in aerial combat compared to the Soviet Union's 128. The Ki-27 had passed its first true test. The Ki-27 continued to dominate the skies over China, aided further by the entry of more modern fighters, like the Ki-43 Oscar. This persisted until early 1942, when the American volunteer group emerged on the China-Burma front. These American pilots flew the more modern P-40 and used ingenious tactics, refusing to engage Japanese aircraft in low-speed dogfights. The aging Ki-27 suffered terrible losses. Still, the Ki-27 was used successfully in Singapore and the Dutch East Indies, but struggled once more in the Philippines when facing American fighters. As it was quickly becoming outclassed, the Ki-27 was relegated to secondary roles on the Japanese mainland in 1943. Many survived until late in the war, where most were spent, primarily in kamikaze attacks. The Ki-27 was extremely maneuverable and had one of the best turn rates in history for a monoplane. The wing loading gives us a good indication of the aircraft's ability to turn, and the Ki-27 had one of the best. Its extremely low weight also contributed to its good climbing capabilities, allowing it to use a very high angle of climb without stalling. Although its speed wasn't breathtaking, the Japanese fighter was faster than all its direct opponents when it entered service. The Ki-27 didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks or armor protection. Its concept was based on it not being hit in the first place. When it was, generally things ended badly. Allied pilots' reports of big balls of fire were not exaggerated in the least. The Ki-27 only had 2 rifle-caliber machine guns. If this was enough to take on early war biplanes, it quickly became an insufficient amount of firepower. Nakajima had previously proposed the Ki-12 fighter, which was rejected in part because of its retractable landing gear and increased complexity. This resulted in the Ki-27's fixed gear design. The Ki-27 had only 2 mass-produced variants. The Kai variants and the Ki-79 were trainer versions that saw considerable numbers, but we won't look at them in detail. Ki-27A. This was the first production version. It was powered by a 780 horsepower Nakajima HA-1B radial engine, a licensed-built Japanese version of the British Bristol Jupiter. It was armed with 2 7.7mm Type 89 machine guns, which were mounted on the sides of the forward fuselage, and fired from within the engine cowling. 565 were built. Ki-27B. The B variant had an improved clear-view canopy and oil cooler. It could also take 4 25kg bombs under the wings. Later models replaced one Type 89 machine gun with a heavier 12.7mm machine gun. 1,492 were built. We will now compare the Ki-27B with one of its fiercest rivals, the Soviet I-16 Type 24. This was the Soviet fighter that proved the toughest challenge during the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. Although the I-16 was quite a nimble fighter, there was no comparison here, as the Ki-27 had a much lower wing loading. The Soviet fighter had a much more powerful engine, but was also almost 400 kilograms heavier. The I-16 was slightly faster than the Ki-27. This was crucial as it allowed the Soviet fighter to disengage. During the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, the Soviets quickly learned that they should avoid engaging Japanese fighters in a low-speed dogfight, and started using hit-and-run tactics, not unlike what the Americans would employ later in Burma with the American Volunteer Group. The Ki-27 had a longer range. Despite this, the I-16 could have its range extended to up to 700 kilometers with drop tanks. There is no official value for the Ki-27's ceiling, and this value is only an estimate. Apparently, the Japanese fighter held an advantage here, even if it was mostly inconsequential. The Ki-27 had better climb performance than the I-16. This was the reason why I-16 pilots dove away from the Ki-27 in order to disengage. In this critical category, the Ki-27 fared far worse than the I-16. The Soviet fighter also featured a sub-variant with 2 20mm cannons, emphasizing the difference between the two fighters. As we can see, despite their differences, the two airplanes were comparable. They proved to be formidable opponents in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, with the Type 24 version able to keep the Japanese aircraft at bay despite suffering significant losses. Hiromichi Shinohara was a Japanese Imperial Army pilot. In 1931 he joined a cavalry regiment and took part in the invasion of Manchuria. He enrolled in the Flight Academy in 1933, and 6 years would pass before he saw battle for the first time. This occurred on May 27, 1939, during the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. He shot down 4 Polikarpov I-16 planes in his first encounter with Soviet forces. He became an ace in less than 24 hours after downing a reconnaissance aircraft and 5 I-15 biplane fighters the next day. No other pilot in history is said to have achieved 10 victories on his first day of combat. But for Shinohara, this was just the beginning, as he went on to achieve a total of 58 victories, including an incredible 11 on June 27th, an Imperial Japanese Army record. On the 27th of August, despite shooting down 3 more Soviet aircraft, he was killed in battle, shot down by an I-16. His plane was witnessed crashing into a lake in flames. As his frontline duty lasted exactly 3 months, he only flew the Nakajima Ki-27 in battle. Because of his achievements, he was swiftly nicknamed the Richthofen of the Orient, a reference to the renowned Red Baron of World War I. Although the Ki-27's maneuverability was undeniably a positive feature, the fact remains that the Japanese's emphasis on more agile fighters would later hurt them against the US, as Japanese pilots became resistant to the introduction of better armed, armored, heavier fighters, having grown accustomed to these early war examples. The Ki-27, however, was just what the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force needed at the time, as it faced a large number of biplanes that were also highly agile. The Ki-27 led to the development of the Ki-43 Oscar, which became considerably more well known in the Western world. While developing the Oscar, requirements included that it had to be as maneuverable as the Ki-27 Nate. This resulted in issues with the design of the aircraft, with Nakajima having to lighten the Ki-43 to more closely resemble the flying characteristics of its predecessor, due to complaints from test pilots. It seems the Oscar never became quite as maneuverable as the Nate. What is your opinion on the Nate? Could this possibly be the most maneuverable mass-produced monoplane ever? Let me know in the comments below which aircraft was even more agile, and remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Your support is highly appreciated.